things could have been done better. The honourable member, very quickly, please. Well, Mr. Speaker, I haven't specifically read the amendments my colleague is referring to. But when it comes to systemic racism, there's an issue which can occur, which is to presume in advance that there is systemic racism or racism. So if there was something in the amendment that automatically assumed that, there might be a problem. For example, in the bill, we see that the Commission needs to report to the government and the public on the type of complaint that is raised on a regular basis. And the RCMP and the CBSA have to report on that. So there will be a way to get an overall view of what's happening and to see whether indeed it's necessary to go further. If, for example, certain problems are raised more often than others, for example, about racism.
The deputy to New Westminster Burnaby in about 6.5 minutes.
And thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And could I ask you if you give me a very clear 1-minute warning as well? I would appreciate that. I'm rising to support, of course, this legislation. Bill C-20 is something that's been needed for some time. And the reality is we've heard from so many stakeholders, the groups that I just cited a few minutes ago, that having an act established in the Public Complaints and Review Commission, amending these acts and statutory instruments is a extremely important and needed improvement to the existing situation. As I mentioned earlier, Mr. Speaker, the fact that the Liberals have not set in place service standards and have not adequately funded this commission is profoundly disturbing. The budget, the proposed budget, is far below what is needed. All the witnesses who appeared before public safety indicated this. So this continues to be a problem. But there is a reality that this bill has been vastly improved through the parliamentary procedure. Now, Mr. Speaker, I mentioned earlier the fact that the Conservatives stalled this legislation for months makes it a bit rich that they're pretending today that they want to see the legislation go through. But I'll be testing that in a few minutes. The reality is report stage amendments normally have to be substantive to be considered. And the fact that we are considering right now deleting the short title, which is a meaningless motion that is only designed to delay the legislation, is something that really saddens me. We know that the legislation is long overdue. It was delayed for months because of filibuster by the Conservatives of public safety. We finally got it through. But it's important to note that 3/4 of the amendments, even at the Public Safety Committee that Conservatives filed on C-20, they withdrew. So they filed it and then withdrew those amendments. That's not the case for the NDP, Mr. Speaker. What we are, as you know, and you've heard it said before, we're the worker bees in the House of Commons, the adults in the room. And what we did is very diligently went to work to make a number of improvements to the legislation. And that's what I want to focus on for the few minutes that are accorded to me. We did not succeed in forcing the government to put in place service standards. We have not yet succeeded in getting adequate funding for the Commission. But what we did do is through a variety of amendments that were passed and looking through, we're talking about a dozen key areas where the NDP sought and succeeded with the support often of all parties in improving the legislation. First off, the Customs and Immigration Union had serious concerns about the lack of union representation in this act. And that is something that we pushed for and achieved. We now have union representation through the Commission process that is vitally important. Secondly, we wanted to increase transparency and accountability, and that is something that the Breaking Barriers Coalition, which is a coalition of civil liberties associations across Canada, was calling for. We ensured, with a number of amendments, more transparency and accountability in the legislation. There was very little that actually ensured the reconciliation process with Indigenous peoples. That is another. We had a number of amendments that passed that ensured that reconciliation had to be taken into consideration throughout the Commission process. We are proud of that. Those series of amendments as well. As I would say, Mr. Speaker, in most cases, what the NDP was proposing is the worker bees in Parliament at the Public Safety Committee. I'm thankful to say, and this shows collaboration from all members, were passed unanimously or often with 3 of the 4 parties around the table supporting. We also wanted to expand the investigative power, including provisions around mental health information. When there is misconduct, it is not just physical medical information, but also often mental health information that can be conclusive. And we were able to get that amendment in as well to improve this legislation. We wanted to make sure, as I mentioned earlier, in terms of transparency and accountability, to ensure that the public is aware of how privileged information is protected within the scope of the Act. That as well, Mr. Speaker, was passed. We wanted to give complainants a longer period to come forward to make a complaint. That is a matter of respect to complainants, and we got that passed as well. We banned the use of non-disclosure agreements to silence victims, and we wanted to make sure that there was no process of intimidation around this, and got that passed as well. We also wanted to make sure that the PCRC had the ability to investigate a complaint related to disciplinary measures taken by the CBSA management, and managed to get that in place as well. Now, Mr. Speaker, all those improvements have meant that this bill is much better, and we need to proceed to third reading. No more delays, and so if you seek it, I believe you will find unanimous consent for the following motion: that notwithstanding any standing order, special order, or usual practice of the House, the motion in amendment at report stage to Bill C-20, an act establishing the Public Complaints and Review Commission and amending certain acts and statutory instruments in the name of the MP for Sturgeon River Parkland, be deemed withdrawn, and Bill C-20, an act establishing the Public Complaints and Review Commission and amending certain acts and statutory instruments, be deemed concurred in at report stage as amended. Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
All those opposed to the honourable member moving the motion will please say nay. I'm hearing some nays. Statements by members. The honourable member for Spadina Fort York.
Mr. Speaker, Mr. Fayaz Karim, a former NDP candidate for Mississauga-Streetsville, recently posted anti-Semitic comments and personal insults against me on his X account. The posts were disturbing. Among other things, he accused me of being a Zionist whore and a Zionist prostitute. Mr. Speaker, there is no such place. There's no place for such language by this former NDP candidate. Respectable debate and different opinions are fair. This vindictive bile is not. Mr. Karim also attacked British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak for his support of Israel. He wrote that Prime Minister Sunak needed a history lesson on the last 6 months and referred to him as a house coolie. Mr. Speaker, the NDP tries to pass itself off as a party of inclusion and diversity. One wouldn't know it with Mr. Karim in their midst. Is this the type of person the NDP wants in its party? I call upon the NDP leader to denounce these anti-Semitic, racist, and insulting ravings.
The honourable member for Milton.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Canada's home to a quarter of the Earth's wetlands, temperate rainforests, and boreal forests, 20% of the world's freshwater, and the longest coastline in the world. We've got precious habitats for birds, fish, and mammals. We have a special responsibility to the world, and we're doing our part. It's Nature Week, so I met with organizations focused on our shared commitment to protect and preserve our greatest natural resource. Big thanks to Nature Canada and the Bruce Trail Conservancy for championing the cause of nature conservation. The Bruce Trail Conservancy is securing and conserving Niagara Escarpment lands, including territory in my riding of Milton, with a 5-year, $5 million grant, beautiful new trails in Lowville. Additionally, Parks Canada's contribution of over $3.5 million to Conservation Halton for the Coots to Escarpment Ecosystem Park showcases our dedication to creating interconnected green spaces. Through Budget 2024, we're also investing in Canada's new national parks to preserve them and create 3 new parks in BC, PEI, and Windsor, Ontario. With Canada's pledge to conserve 30% of our lands and waters by 2030, with $2.5 billion in new funding to combat nature loss, Canada remains unwavering in our commitment to safeguarding our precious ecosystems for generations to come.
Bravo. The honourable member for Red Deer Lacombe.
Mr. Speaker, with more Canadians using food banks than ever before and many on the brink of financial ruin. The next election can't come soon enough.
That's right.
Yet this Prime Minister has insisted on pushing policies that Canadians know are wacko. Handing out needles to prisoners while they're in jail is wacko. Insisting that the budget will balance itself is wacko. Thinking that vitamins and supplements need to be regulated the same as prescription drugs is wacko. Letting repeat offenders out on bail so they can reoffend over and over and over is wacko. Turning a blind eye to foreign interference in our elections is wacko. Letting people smoke meth next to kids in our parks and playgrounds is wacko. After 9 years of wacko policies, Mr. Speaker, it's time for Canadians to switch to a blue Solo cup because the red one's messed up and the orange one's bad luck. Let's bring it home.
The honourable member for Winnipeg North.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Rainbow Stage is Canada's largest and longest-running outdoor theatre. It's truly a jewel in the north end of Winnipeg. Mr. Speaker, this year they will be celebrating 70 years, providing incredible world-class entertainment. Starting on June 27, the first of 2 musicals is going to be on stage. Mabuhay, a new musical, Mr. Speaker, which is going to be an amazing show, and I would encourage people that have never witnessed Rainbow Stage to get out and become a part of something absolutely new, and it's going to be entertaining. That's going to be followed by Mary Poppins, something in which we're all very familiar with. This year is special because with Mabuhay, June being Philippine Heritage Month, it's a great opportunity for us to be able to celebrate the 70th year for Rainbow Stage. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I'm just going to make a reminder that we should have our T-shirts, if we're wearing them, underneath our jackets. That would be nice. That would be nice. Underneath.
It's a new MP.
I know. When we're new here, this is what happens. The honourable member for Nunavut.
On Wednesday, I joined a productive panel discussion with my colleagues from the other House, Senator Don Anderson, Senator Pat Duncan, and Jackie Jacobson, a former MLA in the Northwest Territories, to discuss the Arctic Research Foundation's impressive work in drafting the National Arctic Strategy, which was released in October 2023. This great work was prepared in preparation for the Senate Committee on Fisheries and Oceans. What I appreciated about the strategy is the way that it is organized into 4 pillars, including reconciliation and the production of knowledge, protecting the environment while understanding and adapting to climate change, capacity building and economic development, and Arctic data management. I encourage all levels of governments, Indigenous rights holding groups, and others to use this document to guide policy decisions in the North as they can help make much-needed improvements needed in the North. I thank the communities, the hunters and trappers organizations that help form this strategy, as well as other committees, including communities in Nunavut, NWT, and other Arctic regions. The
honourable member for Châteauguay-Lacolle.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With pride, the municipality of Saint-Cyprien de Napierville inaugurated Joseph Marceau Street. Joseph Marceau was from my riding. He was a patriot exiled in Australia and the only remaining one there. The ceremony took place in the presence of some of his descendants visiting Quebec, for whom it's a real honor to have a patriot as their grandfather. Also in attendance were Marianne Alpin, Speaker for the Société Saint-Jean-Baptiste, and Chantal Pelletier, Mayor of Napierville. Many of these patriots come from my riding. Ties have been forged on both sides of the Pacific, where the democratic ideals of these men are still alive. I'd like to highlight the gesture by Mayor Jean-Marie Mercier of the members of the Saint-Cyprien de Napierville City Council and the Mayor Marianne Alpin and Chantal Pelletier, and they've contributed to our collective duty of remembrance. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
On May 5th, 1945, the Canadian Army finally secured the liberation of the Dutch people from Nazi occupation. It was a welcome end to a fierce year-long campaign starting on D-Day in northern France, continuing through a cold winter bogged down at the Scheldt River, and finally ending with the liberation of Arnhem and surrounding cities. This victory came at a cost of 7,000 Canadian soldiers, but it was also the start of a long and celebrated friendship between the people of Canada and the grateful people of the Netherlands. This friendship gave birth to a huge influx of Dutch immigrants after the war, including my parents, and is still celebrated on both sides of the ocean every year. To Canada, once again, thank you for your selfless service to freedom and justice. And to the many Canadians of Dutch descent across the country, including in Langley, we are a richer and stronger nation because of you. Thank you.
The honourable member for Cape Breton-Canso.
Mr. Speaker, I rise in the House today to congratulate members of the Cape Breton Chorale who are celebrating 50 years of music across the globe. In that time, the chorale has given over 200 performances at home and overseas in places like England, Wales, Ireland, and much more. During their travels, they've shared stages with the likes of Rita McNeil and Celine Dion, and also performed before such dignitaries as Queen Elizabeth II. Founded under its original director, the late Sister Rita Clare, this organization has flourished over half a century in operation. While a lot has changed since 1973, the choir's dedication, Mr. Speaker, to its craft and audiences has been truly unwavering. Mr. Speaker, my riding at Cape Breton Council is world-renowned for its vibrant culture and music. The chorale proudly strengthens that musical stance on the world stage. Cheers to 50 years to all members of the Cape Breton Chorale.
There you go.
The honourable member for Kitchener South Hespeler.
Mr. Speaker, recently I had the honour of welcoming the Minister for Women and Gender Equality, along with the member from Oakville North Burlington and the member from Hamilton Mountain, to Kitchener South Hespeler, where we visited the Grand Valley Institute for Women, a federal facility for incarcerated women. We had a very thorough tour of the facility and, in fact, will need to return to see the minimum security site another time. Incarceration affects not only the offender, but the entire family as well. And I was particularly impressed by the Mother and Child program, which aims to provide support to mothers and expectant mothers in maintaining ongoing relationships with their children. Personally, I feel separation from one's family is one of the most difficult aspects of incarceration. And for 25 years, Patrice has been doing an exemplary job in supporting mothers and their children through these challenges. My thanks to the exceptional staff at Grand Valley Institution for the important work they do in a very challenging environment.
The honourable member for Dufferin-Caledon.
The Iranian regime has sentenced Tomas Salehi to death. His crime? Protesting the death of Mahsa Amini. The sentence comes after he was beaten, tortured, and put in solitary confinement. We all know the Iranian regime. They support Hezbollah, Hamas, and recently attacked Israel. And Canada's response to this outrageous sentence? The use of the death penalty to suppress human rights and freedoms is unjustifiable. Unjustifiable? What a joke. But sadly, it's not surprising. This Liberal NDP government has failed to list the IRGC as a terrorist organization 6 years after Parliament demanded they do it. This Liberal Prime Minister bowed and shook hands with Iran's foreign minister after the IRGC shot down a plane that killed 57 Canadians. Mr. Speaker, let me be clear. Conservatives condemn this sentence. We condemn the imprisonment of Tomas Salehi, and we call for his immediate release.
The honourable member for Whitby.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today to extend my heartfelt congratulations to the Durham Irish Association on the momentous occasion of their 20th anniversary. Established in 2003 by a group of dedicated individuals of Irish descent, this association has been instrumental in preserving and celebrating Irish culture and heritage in Whitby and the surrounding region. The Irish community has very strong roots in the Durham region. Indeed, Irish people were some of the very first settlers in the area and have made many contributions to the area's history. As the MP for this vibrant community, I commend every member who has contributed to the success of the organization. Their dedication has ensured that the Irish spirit not only endures but thrives in the Durham region. May the next 20 years bring even more opportunities for cultural enrichment, community engagement, and celebration of our shared heritage. Salanche, and congratulations again to the Durham Irish Association on 20 years of preserving and celebrating Irish heritage.
The Honourable Member for Edmonton Manning.
Mr. Speaker, after 9 years, shady business has become this government's status quo. It has recently been revealed that the Prime Minister, only Alberta minister, was sneakily cashing checks from a lobbyist who secured $110 million in contracts from his own government, even from his own ministry. Not only that, but until 2 weeks ago, he was listed as a director of a global health imports, a company winning over $8 million in government contracts. Wow. The smell of a looming scandal is undeniably pungent. Despite that, time and time again, the minister has sat quietly in this House, hid behind his government House leader, claiming he did nothing wrong. But if he's so innocent, why doesn't the Minister of Employment stand up in this House today and tell us how much money he got from his lobbying side hustle?
The Honourable Member for Northumberland, Peterborough South.
This NDP Liberal Prime Minister is not worth the cost, the chaos, the drugs, and the crime. After 9 years of this Prime Minister's extremist policies, deadly hard drugs are now available in BC's public spaces, such as parks, coffee shops, and even hospitals. Now this Prime Minister wants to expand his radical experiment from British Columbia to Toronto. Of course, my riding is only an hour away from Toronto, and my residents love going to the beautiful city of Toronto, shopping there, going to work, and cheering on their great Toronto Maple Leafs. However, if the Prime Minister expands his radical experiment, there's no doubt that it'll spread chaos, drugs like never seen before in Toronto, and that chaos and that tragedy will be spread to surrounding communities such as my own. It is time this Prime Minister ended his terrible radical experiment, which is costing lives. End it right now!
The Honourable Member for Surrey Centre.
Mr. Speaker, April is over, and with it brings the end of Sikh Heritage Month. This April, Sikh Punjabis made strides across Canada and broke records across the nation. In my home city of Surrey, Gurdwara Dashmesh Darbar hosted the largest Vaisakhi Nagar Kirtan parade with over 550,000 attendees that traveled from across the world. They sang beautiful Kirtan, served amazing langar, and shared their history and culture to all. Then, only a week later, Punjabi superstar Diljit Dosanjh made history at BC Place. Dosanjh kicked off his Canada-wide tour with a sold-out show to an audience of more than 54,000 people. Mr. Speaker, the energy was electric and the vibe was amazing. From topping billboards to selling out stadiums, feats that are usually left for the likes of Taylor Swift, they are now quickly spreading to the Punjabi community. Mr. Speaker, as Sikh Heritage Month wrapped up its 5th anniversary, and with Punjabi Sikhs breaking records every day, I've never been prouder to represent such a vibrant and flourishing community. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Good job. The Honourable Member for London Fanshawe.
Being the Member of Parliament for London Fanshawe is a privilege that I will never take lightly. Parliament is supposed to be a place where elected representatives from across the country work together to make life better for those they represent. We may disagree on exactly how that should happen, but we are supposed to discuss issues and events respectfully. We owe it to our constituents. Today was an extraordinary day. Another low in a pattern of behavior that has consistently undermined this place year after year. There are those who use every form of misinformation, intimidation, gamesmanship, meaningless slogans, and rage farming solely for the purpose of attaining and holding on to power. I know many members have questioned what we have become, and I'm not the only woman in this place who wonders if she can remain here. But I also know that my family and I have poured our lives into this institution and the ideals it espouses. I will continue to fight to stop those who undermine this important place. We have to do better. People need us to do better.
Bravo. The Honourable Member for Abitibi, James Bay, Nunavik, AU. Mr. Speaker, student Annabelle St. Pierre had a heart attack in the middle of gym class in Sainte-Terre and will forever be grateful for the quick and efficient efforts of her rescuers, as well as for the first aid courses offered at her school. After a blow to the head, Annabelle passed out and fell to the ground. The silver lining? Her gym teacher was David Leblond. David had been training his grade 9 students in CPR techniques for almost 20 years. Helped by staff members Cheryl Chalifou and Joanie Filion, he used the defibrillator twice and was lucky enough to save Annabelle. Annabelle has no recollection of the operation that saved her life, but since that day, a precious bond has been forged between her and her rescuers. So I'd like to pay tribute to and congratulate David, Cheryl, and Joanie for their heroic intervention and wish Annabelle every success as she continues her studies at Cégep Val-d'Or. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Portage-Lisgar.
Mr. Speaker, here is a memo to corporate Canada from the next Prime Minister of Canada. Fire your lobbyists, ignore the politicians, and go straight to the people. There are far too many corporations that have Stockholm Syndrome in this country. They feel grateful when their taxes only go up a little bit, or when the job-killing regulation isn't as destructive as it could have been. To be clear, advancing your interests isn't done by meeting politicians or holding luncheons or forums. If you have a good policy proposal, you need to convince Canadians that it's good for them. You must convince waitresses, carpenters, truckers, seniors, and families. Because when we start hearing it at the doorstep, that's when we'll know that it's a good idea. Because that's who Conservatives will be listening to, the common sense of the common people. So if you want to stop the latest Liberal tax hike or get bureaucracy out of the way to build homes, mines, factories, pipelines, or anything else, you should cancel your fancy lunch. Fire your lobbyists and go straight to the people. Unlike Liberals who only listen to insiders, Conservatives will always listen to the common sense of the common people.
That's right here. Well
Fire
said.
the lobbyists!
The Honourable Member for Niagara Centre.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this weekend I will be attending the Sports Wall of Fame Class of 2024 induction ceremony in the city of Welland. I wish to congratulate and recognize Dan Girardi, Jack J.B. Ballantyne, and Steve Latinovich for their contributions to hockey, Corey Lee for his contributions to judo, Lauren Aiello for her contributions to rowing, Mike Rayo for his contributions to basketball, and Ray Sarkis for his contributions in sport at Niagara College. I also wish to congratulate the 3 teams being inducted for winning Ontario championships. The 1973 Welland Atlas Steel Tykes baseball team, the 1977 Club Richelieu midget baseball team, and the 2016 Jean Vanier Lynx Senior Girls High School basketball team. Mr. Speaker, sports are more than just games. They're powerful agents of positive change within our communities. All of these individuals have inspired future athletes in our community at large. I look forward to recognizing the successes this weekend, Mr. Speaker. Thank you very much.
Just a quick reminder before we go to oral questions that, of course, statements by members, of course, is to 60 seconds. We had a few offenders, but we, of course, try to get them in to make sure that we have these great statements for our ridings and for the people. Oral questions, question orale. Honorable député.
The Honourable Member for Mégantic-l'Érable. After 9 years of extreme ideological policies, this Prime Minister is not worth the cost in lives lost by drug overdose. Today marks exactly 1 week, 7 days since the Premier of British Columbia asked him to back down from his disastrous experiment with legalizing hard drugs. When will the Prime Minister, the Liberal Prime Minister, put an end to his extreme policy that has caused chaos and death? Give us a date, please. The Honourable Minister for Mental Health and Addictions.
Mother, and as a member of this government, the tragedies that are happening across this country and the lives lost are completely devastating. It's shameful that the opposition continues to politicize this. In BC asked the federal government to work with them on a 3-year pilot program. They have come to us and asked for an amendment to that proposal. We are working through it with them because, Mr. Speaker, we have to get this right. We are here to save lives. We need to get it right with law enforcement. We need to get it right with our public health services because our focus here is to save lives so that people don't die alone. They have no plan and...
The Honourable Member for Mégantic-L'Érable. This Prime Minister should be ashamed to have waited 7 days and to still not have announced putting an end to this program that is costing lives every day. 6 lives are lost every day in British Columbia from drug overdose, and the Liberals are just waiting around. There are dirty syringes on soccer fields. Nurses have to stop breastfeeding their children because they fear for the health of their children from the fumes of drugs used in hospital, Mr. Speaker. Crime is on the rise. People are afraid, and Quebecers are affected by this crisis too. When will the Prime Minister stop dilly-dallying and finally put an end to his radical experiment? We want a date, please. The Honourable Government House Leader. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. British Columbia has suggested some adjustments to their pilot project. We support them. Our approach is, and always has been, saving lives and reducing danger in communities. That is what we have committed to do, and that's what we are doing. We will not be taking any lessons, Mr. Speaker, from the Conservative Party. Their immoral policies failed. In fact, even an advisor to Stephen Harper called those policies very, very old and immoral. So we will not take lessons from them, and we will fix this on our own. Thank you. The Honourable Member for Mégantic-L'Érable. Well, you know, the Prime Minister's hesitation is very worrying. He only has to say the word to put an end to this deadly experiment because he's the one responsible for Canada's criminal laws. End it now. It's as easy and simple as that. It's disturbing to see him stubbornly maintaining this extreme policy and with the support of the Bloc Québécois. This morning in the Journal de Montréal, we read that there's crack, heroin, and excrement in Montreal's Chinatown and in Montreal. In fact, the daycare in Chinatown and Montreal is at the center of growing violence, but just yesterday, the Bloc Québécois health critic reiterated his support for decriminalization. Will the Prime Minister finally say no today to legalizing hard drugs in Montreal and across the country? The Honourable Government House Leader. Mr. Speaker, the member across the way knows full well that there have not been any official requests made by authorities in Montreal, in Quebec, or elsewhere. So this pilot project will not be extended to Quebec or to Montreal. He knows that full well, and I urge him to be factual. But, Mr. Speaker, we will not be taking any lessons from this Conservative Party, whose main advisor said that what the Conservatives did while they formed government was immoral. The Honourable Member for Stormont on the South Lake Glengarry.
Since the BC NDP government begged this Prime Minister to reverse his decision that made it legal to shoot up heroin on public transit and to smoke meth and blow it into the faces of nurses in hospitals, on what date will the Liberals make that illegal again in British Columbia?
The Honourable Minister of Mental Health and Addictions.
Mr. Speaker, the province of BC came to the federal government with a 3-year pilot program using decriminalization so that people would not die alone, that they would get health care, Mr. Speaker. The BC government has asked for an amendment to their proposal. We are working through it with them, Mr. Speaker, because we need to get it right. We want people to live, Mr. Speaker, not be criminalized. We want them to get health care. The opposition doesn't have a plan, and all they do is stand there and shamefully fundraise off the lives of people who are dying.
The Honourable Member for Stormont Dundas, South Glengarry.
It has been a week. Why is this not done already? The stories in BC are horrifying. Heroin shot up in parks, on buses, and even at Tim Hortons in Maple Ridge. Nurses having meth smoke blown in their face. Parents in Abbotsford scouring sports fields before their kids' games to make sure there's no needles and syringes around. But it gets worse. The Prime Minister won't even rule out expanding this to cities like Montreal and Toronto that have asked for the same craziness. Why won't they clearly give a date and frankly just end this failed policy now in BC and never expand this anywhere else in Canada?
The Honourable Government House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, ever since the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms was born 42 years ago, Canadians have had confidence that their federal government will respect their charter-guaranteed rights and freedoms. Now, the Conservative Party will not say they have promised to tear up the Charter of Rights in matters of criminal justice. Now, where will they stop? They have not ruled out extending it to reproductive rights. They have not ruled out extending it to the rights of people for a fair trial. Where will these Conservatives stop when it comes to ripping up the rights of Canadians, Mr. Speaker?
L'honorable député de Manicouagan.
The honourable member for Manicouagan. Mr. Speaker, it's clear that there's a reason behind the plan to bring CBC and Radio-Canada closer together. The goal is to protect the CBC from a future Conservative government that plans to make cuts to English-language public television. It has nothing to do with modernization. It has nothing to do with digital. It has nothing to do with efficiency. It's just management's means of defending itself against a possible future Conservative government. They are prepared to sacrifice Radio-Canada's identity to save the English-language CBC. Can the minister assure us that she has absolutely no intention of transforming Radio-Canada into a French-language version of the CBC?
The Ministre du Patrimoine Canadien.
The Honourable Canadian Heritage Minister. Mr. Speaker, the Bloc Québécois is speculating, and I would encourage them to be cautious with their speculation about what's occurring with Radio-Canada. I would like to reassure them they love Radio-Canada, as we do, and I would like to reassure them that French language content and programming for Radio-Canada will remain distinct. Francophones throughout Canada watch Radio-Canada. Radio-Canada will use taxpayer money wisely. We know what the Conservatives want to do, though. They want to basically defund the public broadcaster, Mr. Speaker. The Honourable Member for Manicouagan. Mr. Speaker, the Heritage Minister is working on a plan on her end. CBC's management team is working on a plan on its end. The two aren't talking to each other, and they have no idea what each other's plans are. This is yet another example of the federal government's legendary efficiency. And these are the people we're supposed to be counting on to ensure Radio-Canada's independence from CBC. These are the people we are supposed to be counting on to ensure the future of broadcasting our culture. Will the minister heed the Bloc's proposal and make the CBC and Radio-Canada two separate independent Crown corporations? The Honourable Canadian Heritage Minister. Mr. Speaker, the Bloc does not seem to understand that Crown corporations are managed internally at arm's length from government, and that is very important for freedom of the press, for our public broadcaster. Now, I commit to assessing the financial structure and governance of CBC and Radio-Canada to ensure that it is exactly what is needed in our times in 2024. The Bloc Québécois was not able to protect the public broadcaster from cuts when the Conservatives were in power, and they will not be able to protect Radio-Canada from a future Conservative government, Mr. Speaker. The Honourable Member for Rosemont, La Petite Patrie. Mr. Speaker, for 6 months now, Palestinians in Gaza have been subjected to bombing every single day. Over 34,000 people have been killed, including more than 14,000 children. A humanitarian crisis is unfolding before our very eyes. 1.5 million people have been displaced without medication, without fuel or food. The Liberals promised to issue 1,000 visas, but only 100 or so have actually been issued. 4 months after calling Immigration Canada, Ahmad had no answer, so he made his way here on his own. Today he has a question for the Immigration Minister. Will the minister save the lives of his nephews and nieces who are trapped in hell?
The Honourable Minister.
The Honourable Minister of Immigration. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We are working around the clock to get people out of Gaza. We have issued more than 100 visas, though. People are currently traveling from there to Canada. We are defending this operation, bringing people here, but Canada does not control exits from Rafah. But when people are able to exit, which we don't control, then they have biometric testing, and then we're able to bring them here. Thank you.
moldy homes, no clean water, impassable roads, no internet. This is the reality of First Nation, Inuit, and Métis peoples in Canada under the Liberals and the Conservatives.
That's right.
Indigenous communities have identified over $400 billion in infrastructure needs because of historic underfunding. Yet the Liberals barely scratched the surface of this gap with the federal budget. What is the Liberals' plan to correct their discriminatory funding choices?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Thank you very much, Speaker. I want to thank the member opposite for an important question. There's nothing more important to our government than reconciliation with the Indigenous peoples. And that's why from the very beginning, we've been working very closely in partnership with all Indigenous peoples across the country in ensuring that we rectify for the past injustices, to make the necessary investments. It is difficult work. It's work that we'll continue to do with Indigenous peoples, and that's why in this budget and budget passed, we have made tremendous amount of investments in Indigenous communities across the country, and will continue to do that work. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Kelowna Lake Country.
Liberals continue to insist they don't have enough data from the BC government to end the open drug use of hard drugs like cocaine or fentanyl on streets, in playgrounds, and in hospitals in British Columbia. The BC government confirmed that they sent the Liberals the data that they requested within hours of asking. But if the minister can't make a decision, how about the fact that more British Columbians sadly died of overdoses in January and February of 2024 than in all of 2014? Wow. Why are these Liberals not being honest with Canadians and just end their radical drug policy?
The Honourable Minister of Mental Health and Addictions.
Mr. Speaker, every step of the way we have been working hand in hand with provincial jurisdictions, communities, and municipalities across this country, speaking to families, speaking to health teams to understand how we save lives, Mr. Speaker. We are working with the province of BC on the amendment to their proposal. We need to get it right, Mr. Speaker. We need to make sure that communities are safe, but we also need to make sure that people aren't dying alone, that they are getting the healthcare services that they need. You can't treat someone if they're dead, Mr. Speaker. We are committed to saving lives.
The Honourable Member for Kelowna Lake Country.
Well, Mr. Speaker, if that member thinks that BC's experience with open public drug use is so great, then why isn't she advocating for it in her province? I was talking to a resident just 2 days ago from my constituency.
Hold on a sec. We are getting a lot of yelling back and forth, and I would appreciate it if people could just keep it down. I know, I'm hearing a lot. I'm hearing a lot from all ends of the chamber. So I just want to make sure that we keep the down as we debate these important issues. The Honourable Member of Kelowna Lake Country.
Well, Mr. Speaker, if that member thinks that the BC experience with open public drug policies and drug use is so great, then why isn't she advocating for it in her own province? I was talking to a resident from my community just a couple nights ago who told me she came around the corner from her apartment to be faced with something that burnt her eyes. And people were openly using drugs on the street. She is rightfully concerned about what she is exposed to, and unfortunately this is not an isolated incident. After 9 years of this Prime Minister, enough is enough. Why are these Liberals not being honest with Canadians and just end their drug policies?
The Honourable Government House Leader.
Of course, Mr. Speaker, that question has been asked many times and answered many times by my honourable colleague, the Minister. What I want to know, this member is a female member of her caucus. This morning, the headline reads, "Conservatives don't rule out using notwithstanding clause beyond criminal justice matters."
Shameful.
50 years ago, Roe v. Wade was enacted in the U.S., and women have lived under that protection in the U.S. for 50 years. For 42 years.
Order. Goes all ways. So to be able to keep it down, so I can actually hear the answers, the questions, and of course the answers. The Honourable Government House Leader.
From the top.
15 seconds.
For 50 years, women in the U.S. have lived under the protection of Roe v. Wade. For 42 years in Canada, women in Canada have lived under the protection of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Now Conservatives will not rule out using the notwithstanding clause beyond criminal justice matters. Will that member stand in her place and tell us what rights from women does she intend to take away?
Hear, hear.
to get you back up to 20% of the polls, Steve. Let's say 50 seats in the next election.
Ready for the next question? Yes. All right. The honourable member for Langley Aldergrove.
After 9 years of this Liberal NDP Prime Minister, it is clear that he is not worth the crime, the chaos, the drugs, and the disorder. As a direct result of his extremist drug policies, we have open drug use in front of an elementary school in Langley, discarded needles at a playground in Willoughby, and crack smoking at a bus stop in Brookswood. People from Langley want to know, when is this Prime Minister going to end his extremist experiment to legalize hard drugs like cocaine, fentanyl, and opioids?
The Honourable Minister of Mental Health and Addictions.
Mr. Speaker, I will say this again. We have to approach the opioid crisis and the illegal toxic drug supply with compassion, science, evidence, and healthcare, Mr. Speaker. On this side of the House, we all want the same thing: public safety and access to public healthcare services so that people don't die alone. We are approaching the issue of public consumption with urgency, Mr. Speaker, working with the BC government on their requested amendments to their proposal. BC asked for this exemption. We will continue to work with them hand in hand because families are demanding it of us. They don't want to lose their loved ones, and on this side of the House, we will save lives.
The honourable member for Langley Aldergrove.
Well, the results are in, and they're a disaster. 2,500 opioid overdoses last year in British Columbia.
Order. If we need to shut things down over here, I need to shut things down over there. So try to keep the chatter down. The honourable member for Langley Aldergrove.
The results are in. And they are a disaster. 2,500 deaths last year, and 6 on average every day this year. Now, the Liberal minister responsible for hard drug use says, well, she's waiting for more information from BC, but the BC government says they've given her all the information, as if 2,500 drug deaths in 1 year isn't enough data to go on. So Canadians want to know, why are Liberals misleading them? And when are they going to put an end to this disastrous, failed drug use experiment?
The Honourable Government House Leader.
That question has been asked and answered. BC has been making adjustments to their pilot project, and of course, Mr. Speaker, we are supporting them. But I had no luck with the last member. Let me ask this member. Conservatives will not rule out using the notwithstanding clause.
Order, order. As I have said before, if I need to shut the noise down in one corner of the room, I need to shut it down in the other corner of the room. So please let the honourable member respond so we can get on to the next question. The Honourable Government House Leader from the top. All right.
Mr. Speaker, of course BC is making adjustments to their pilot project, and we are supporting them in that endeavour, and the member should be under no ambiguity about that. The member is ambiguous, however, like his previous colleague, about which charter protections that party would rip up. Is it reproductive rights? Is it the right to a fair trial? Is it the right to free expression, Mr. Speaker? That member needs to get up, that party needs to get up, that leader needs to get up and tell Canadians exactly which fundamental charter rights they will be taking away from Canadians.
I'm trying to shut down that end. I'm trying to shut down this end. I want to be able to hear the answers to the questions in the answer, and that's enough of that. The honourable member for North Okanagan, Shuswap.
Mr. Speaker, after 9 years, this Prime Minister is clearly not worth the cost. His minister responsible for hard drugs on the streets is misleading Canadians. She said the Liberal government is waiting for more information from BC on if they should reverse their decision that allows cocaine, opioids and fentanyl in parks, playgrounds and hospitals. The BC NDP government confirmed they answered within hours to the government's request for more information. Why is this Liberal NDP government misleading Canadians, and why can't they just end their disastrous drug policy?
The Honourable Government House Leader.
Well, Mr. Speaker, that member needs to unplug from the wall, replug and reboot. He's not listening to the earlier questions. We've told them very clearly. BC has requested changes, and we are working with BC to make those changes. But maybe that member will tell us specifically which freedoms, which rights described in the 42-year-old Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms that Canadians cherish will he be advocating removing from Canadian women, from Canadian people? Is it the freedom of expression? Is it reproductive rights?
The honourable member for North Okanagan, Shuswap.
I'd like to remind the member that his government illegally invoked the Emergencies Act, removing civil liberties from Canadians.
Exactly what they did. Guilty of it. Broke the law.
After 9 years of radical NDP Liberal government drug policies and toxic drug deaths in BC reaching a 380% increase, the number of children aged 10 to 18 who have died from overdoses has increased by more than 5 times. Opioids and illicit drugs are now the leading cause of death of youth aged 10 to 18 in BC. Will the Prime Minister end his radical drug policies, or will he continue to show he's simply not worth the cost?
The Honourable Minister of Labour.
Speaker, there are right ways to go about things, and then there are explosive and dramatic and catastrophic ways to go about things. To talk about using the notwithstanding clause, and I quote, all...
I'm going to make sure the Honourable Minister has his time. The Honourable Minister of Labour.
The Leader of the Opposition's response that all of my proposals are constitutional and we will make them constitutional using whatever tools the Constitution allows me to use to make them constitutional. I think you know exactly what I mean, he says. They will happen and they will stay in place for anybody like me who has a right that was afforded to him because of this charter in my lifetime. These are chilling words that they...
L'honorable député de Repentigny.
The Honourable Member for Repentigny. The Honourable Member for Repentigny. Canada's greenhouse gas emissions increased in 2021-2022. That is why the advisory group appointed by the Environment Minister himself is issuing a warning. The warning is, climate policies work when they exist. In other words, they do not work if they do not exist, such as in the oil industry, where emissions are still rising. And emissions are bound to soar with this week's Wednesday opening of Trans Mountain, a new dirty oil pipeline with no emissions cap for oil. When is the minister going to rein in big oil instead of building pipelines? The Honourable Environment Minister. Mr. Speaker, my colleague should closely read the report published yesterday because it says that as compared with 2019, before the pandemic, our emissions are 44 million tons lower than they were in 2019. That is the equivalent of getting half of Canada's vehicles off the road. The last time our GHG emissions were this low, when O.J. Simpson was on trial a long time ago. It's been a long time since our emissions were this low. So our plan is working and we need to continue to fight climate change. The Honourable Member for Repentigny. Yesterday, the minister boasted that Canada was, I quote, the only major oil producer in the world to have proposed putting a cap on oil emissions. The operative word being propose, not impose. I would remind the minister that once he had greater ambitions than proposing to be more progressive than Russia and Saudi Arabia. And while the minister is proposing to do better than those countries, well, he's also opening up a shiny new Trans Mountain pipeline. When are we going to see some action? Not action to increase emissions, but action to reduce them. The Honourable Environment Minister. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. If my colleague had read yesterday's report, she would see that our track record is similar to that of Germany, that of Italy, and better than Italy and the United States. We're not like Russia and Iran here. Our climate performance is better than the United States's. We have already tabled our consultation document to cap oil and gas emissions. We will have draft regulation this year and final regulations by next year. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Parkland.
Well, Mr. Speaker, this NDP Liberal Prime Minister isn't worth the crime, chaos, drugs, and disorder that he's unleashed on our streets. And after 9 years, this Prime Minister's radical experiments with legalized hard drugs is turning our hospitals, beaches, and schoolyards into one giant drug injection site. Our children are witnessing drug abuse, discarded needles, and overdoses as they play and learn. And the Prime Minister's taxpayer-funded drugs are now ending up in the hands of our children. When will this Prime Minister stop treating our communities like his own personal woke petri dish and end his radical experiments on Canadians? Hear, hear.
The Honourable Government House Leader.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Once again, that question has been asked many times and answered. I wonder about their hearing over there. But let me read, we get mail, Mr. Speaker. Let me read a quote. Canada's significant credit strengths will continue to preserve its AAA-rated sovereign credit profile, underpinned by its high economic strength and very strong institutions and governance. Together, these factors provide Canada with a strong foundation for future growth and very high degree of economic resiliency to potential shocks. Mr. Speaker, thank you to Moody's credit ratings.
Hear, hear. The Honourable Member for York Simcoe.
After 9 years of this NDP Liberal government, Canadians are struggling. In rampant crime, drugs and disorder have become the norm. Instead of offering treatment and support to those who need it, this Prime Minister is jeopardizing the safety of Canadians by allowing hard drugs to be used openly in public, on buses, in hospitals, and right in front of children and their families. Enough! Will these Liberals end their radical drug policies, or will they inflict the same chaos seen in BC elsewhere?
The Honourable Government House Leader.
That question has been asked and answered, but the letter goes on, Mr. Speaker. It says, in addition, Canada's credit profile has very limited susceptibility to event risks, supported by stable political institutions, a strong and well-regulated banking system, and reserve currency status, which underscores the government's deep and unfettered market access. At the same time, despite an initial sharp deterioration in the government's fiscal position from the pandemic, Canada's debt ratios have since materially improved, and the government is pursuing a gradual path of fiscal consolidation. Thank you, Moody's credit rating.
The Honourable Member for Northumberland, Peterborough South.
We all know, Canadians have never had it so good. We hear it over and over again. During Wednesday's question period, the Prime Minister guaranteed to the Canadian public, those who are counting on interest rates going down, that they will start coming down in the next 2 months. That's great news. The problem? The Bank of Canada, the organization that actually decides interest rates, says they haven't decided that yet. So, Mr. Speaker, simple question for the government. Who's lying, the Governor of the Bank of Canada or the Prime Minister?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Based on what the Conservatives are saying, then they are going to need to explain to Canadians how Canada is rated #1 for budget balance by the International Monetary Fund, maintains a AAA credit rating reaffirmed by Moody's just yesterday, has the best net debt to GDP ratio and the lowest deficit in the G7, has been projected by the IMF and the OECD to have the strongest economic growth in the G7, and is #1 in the world when you adjust per capita in foreign direct investment. Mr. Speaker, on this side of the House, we continue to lead. On that side of the House, they continue to mislead.
The Honourable Member for Northumberland, Peterborough South.
Mr. Speaker, over the last 6 quarters, we've had declining GDP per capita growth. We've had 0 GDP per capita growth in the last 10 years. And this government's response, more spending money, more spreading fire on the already burning out of control inflationary fire. $61 billion in new spending. But once again, I ask, Canadians are barely hanging on. Some of them are going to lose their houses short. Will they stand behind the Prime Minister's word and guarantee that interest rates will go down? Or is it more misinformation from this government?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Deputy Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, Canadians shouldn't listen to the trumped-up rhetoric of the Conservatives when it comes to our economy. Just yesterday, the independent Governor of the Bank of Canada reaffirmed that due to our commitment to the key fiscal guardrails we have put in place, that he believes, and I quote, "Since the government's net fiscal plan hasn't changed a lot, I don't think it's going to have a big effect on our projections for the economy or inflation." And with inflation in the target range for 3 months in a row, Canadians have reason for hope. Conservatives are looking to cut our investments in the middle class, and we're not going to let them.
The honourable member for Edmonton-Griesbach.
Edmontonians are fed up with Loblaws' sky-high prices and record profits at their expense. Every time they go to the grocery store, they have to put food back on the shelves. The Liberals are doing nothing about it, and the Conservatives are in the pocket of Galen Weston. People are frustrated, using their power to boycott Loblaws. Edmontonians deserve a government that fights for them, not wealthy CEOs. When will the Liberals open their ears, start listening to Canadians, and stop the greed?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Deputy Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I know that the member opposite feels that grocery prices are too high, and they have been certainly. But good news is that the CPI index has showed that food prices are stabilizing in our economy, which is good news for Canadians. What our government is doing is proposing multiple rounds of reforms to our Competition Act, and it's good to see the NDP and other parties starting to work with us. Just this week, earlier this week, we got C-59 through the Finance Committee, which was great progress on reforming our competition laws. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Courtenay Alberni.
Sadly, Alberta is on track to have the most toxic drug deaths per capita in Canada by June. Clearly, Alberta's Conservatives' recovery-only model is tragically failing. But you know who's jumped on board to support it? The Conservative leader. And while he regularly meets up with far-right extremist groups, he won't even meet with Mom Stop the Harm, families who've lost loved ones to the toxic drug crisis. That's the kind of guy he is. But the Liberals have let this happen by not taking a national approach to fighting this crisis. When will this Liberal government finally intervene?
Anybody want to pick that one up? Okay, sorry, my one eye is not working. The Honourable Minister of Mental Health and Addictions.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I want to thank the member for his question, because too many Canadians are dying every day from this ever-challenging illegal toxic drug supply. But the opposition leader talks a big talk about investing in treatment. But when they were last in government, they cut 2/3 of their own drug treatment fund. Will he slam the door in the face of those groups like Mom Stop the Harm who are asking for help? Will he cancel safe consumption sites knowing that this saves lives? Will he refuse to meet the moment of this situation and just use slogans and do nothing? Or will he commit to harm reduction, prevention, treatment, and saving lives?
L'honorable député de Pontiac.
The honourable member for Pontiac. Mr. Speaker, the other day, I was asking myself why it's so important for Canada to reduce its emissions. And it's important for our economy. We can't thrive economically if we aren't thriving in the area of the environment. Looking at the National Inventory Report, I was pleased to see that we have reduced our greenhouse gas emissions. So I'd like to ask the Minister of the Environment what next steps are to ensure that we remain on the right path. The Honourable Minister of the Environment. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to thank my colleague for her question. Yes, yesterday's report, as confirmed by the Canadian Climate Institute, the report shows that we are reaching our 2026 interim goal and our 2030 goals. We're on the right path. We have reduced our GHG emissions to an extent that is the equivalent of removing 15 million vehicles from our roads. But we do need to do more, and that is why we're aiming to have a carbon-neutral transportation network by 2035 and a GHG cap, which will be coming out soon.
Thousand Islands, Rita Lakes.
$110 million. That's how much this Liberal employment minister's private company landed from this Liberal government. Wow. The Liberal minister used his role to get meetings for his business partner with the finance minister and with the prime minister's office, using his position to enrich his business partner and himself. After 9 years of this NDP Liberal government, it's clear they're not worth the cost and certainly not the corruption. So how much taxpayer cash did this Liberal minister pocket on the backs of hardworking Canadians?
Corruption. The Honourable Government House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, Canada, of course, has the most stringent ethics rules for elected parliamentarians in almost all of the world. The minister has addressed this question, and it's pretty clear the Conservatives will do anything they can to distract from their vow to rip up the Charter of Rights and Freedoms.
That's right. The honourable member for Leeds, Grenville, Thousand Islands, and Rideau Lakes.
Of course, Speaker, these Liberals are trying to distract and divide. A common-sense Conservative government would, of course, only use the notwithstanding clause on matters of criminal justice. It's unconscionable that this government would allow a mass murderer like the Quebec mosque shooter to ever be released from prison. He murdered 6 innocent worshippers, and the only way he should have left maximum security was in a box.
That's right.
Our question was about the corruption of their government, the employment minister pocketing cash on the backs of taxpayers. Will they do the right thing and call in the RCMP?
That's right.
The honourable government house leader.
Well, it's very nice, Mr. Speaker, to have some clarity on that. I remind that member that at one time in this country, reproductive rights were a criminal matter. So could he lay out in very specific detail for this House, now that he's talking about the notwithstanding clause, very specifically, would he make reproductive rights for women in this country into a criminal matter? Once again, yes or no?
Yeah. The honourable member for St. Albert, Edmonton.
Speaker, a lobbying firm owned by the business partner of the lone Alberta minister secured $110 million in federal contracts. As money went out the door, the minister was receiving payments from the very same lobbying firm. This is scandalous. Canadians deserve to know, what was the minister's cut? How much was he paid?
The honourable government house leader.
Canada has incredibly stringent ethics rules, Mr. Speaker, and the minister has addressed those questions. But this member has, I don't know if he's communicated with his honourable friend that just got up, but maybe he could answer for us specifically now. Which criminal matters will apply to the ripping up of Canada's fundamental rights and freedoms? I would ask him to be very specific, point us to chapter and verse. Which rights of Canadians is he vowing to rip up today?
Hear, hear. The honourable member for St. Albert, Edmonton.
Mr. Speaker, the minister is clearly in full cover-up mode because it gets worse. The minister's business partner was lobbying the minister's own department as checks were being cut from the lobbying firm to the minister. If that doesn't smell of self-dealing and corruption, I don't know what does. So again, how much did the minister pocket from this lobbying firm since he was appointed at cabinet?
The honourable government house leader.
Well, of course, Mr. Speaker, the minister has addressed that question, but I want to return to this theme. The Conservatives...
We have a number of questions to go, so I do want to make sure that we have order in the House. The honourable government house leader.
Mr. Speaker, it's pretty clear those folks over here have not really spoken and gotten their story straight. We have this member proposing to put reproductive rights back into a category of criminal behavior. We have other members who will not answer which specific rights they will take away. This member has refused to stand up and answer the question of which, is it the freedom of expression? What specific rights would your leader take away as a result of his vow to tear up the Charter of Rights and Freedoms?
Make sure the questions and answers through the chair. L'honorable député de...
The honourable member for Terrebonne. Mr. Speaker, SMEs are increasingly telling us that the federal government is acting predatory about CEBA. They're telling us that they've paid back the entirety of their Canada Emergency Business Account loan, but because of delays of sometimes only a few days that they're not even responsible for, the federal government is still cutting their $20,000 grant. These Liberals are showing a great deal of intransigence, and they're threatening these businesses with bankruptcy. Why? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
And I want to thank that member for continued advocacy for small businesses in Canada. We share that view, and that is why that the CEBA program supported over 900,000 small businesses through the pandemic, and we estimate 80% of them have repaid their loans so far. As we move away from the pandemic, we are taking serious concrete action to support small businesses, both by providing funding and cutting costs, Mr. Speaker. And I'm getting heckled, of course, by the Conservatives who voted against every single measure that we have put forward since 2015 to support small businesses. Thank you.
Well, now the deputy to Terrebonne.
The Honourable Member for Terrebonne. Mr. Speaker, the government is supposed to support struggling businesses and not hit them when they're down. This is a perfect yet upsetting illustration of how the federal government mismanages programs. You can't get a human being on the line when you call the federal government. This rigid way of managing things shows no humanity. Can the government tell us how many businesses have paid back the money but will still miss out on $20,000 due to the federal government's lack of humanity?
Thank you again, Mr. Speaker. I answered that question, the previous answer, with 80%, nearly 80% of small businesses have actually already paid back their CEBA loans. As we move forward from the pandemic, small businesses have nearly 3 years until the end of 2026, Mr. Speaker, to repay their CEBA loans, and they have access to low 5% interest rate. Meanwhile, we are investing in communities, strengthening our economy. Budget 2024 has a number of supports for small businesses, whether it's through supporting startups with AI, quantum. Mr. Speaker, I'm looking forward to more to come to speak to and more.
The Honourable Member for Coast Bay Central Notre Dame.
Mr. Speaker, last week, Winston at the Gandern Area Food Bank confirmed that usage is up 44% in just 6 months. He's concerned about volunteer burnout, Mr. Speaker. The CEO of Food Banks Canada now says that due to record-smashing demand, food banks are on the brink. For folks forced to now use food banks, Mr. Speaker, who never had to do it before, this government and this NDP Liberal Prime Minister is not worth the cost. So will he stop his increase in carbon tax by 23%, or better still, axe the tax so that Canadians can afford to put food on the table?
Yeah, axe the tax. The Honourable Minister of Labour.
$1,192 for a family of 4 in Newfoundland and Labrador, Mr. Speaker. $760 for a family of 4 in New Brunswick. $824 in Nova Scotia. $880 in PEI. $1,120 in Ontario. $1,200 in Manitoba. $1,800 in Alberta. These aren't phony benefits. These aren't chicken feed, as it's been described by the other side. This is cold, hard cash. This goes into the pockets of Canadians. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Yorkton Melville.
Canadians cannot wait for a Conservative government to restore all of the rights and freedoms that this government has destroyed. After 9 years, this NDP Liberal Prime Minister has driven 2 million people to food banks. With record-smashing demand and donations drying up, the CEO of Food Banks Canada says food banks are becoming unsustainable. Knowing Canadians are suffering, this Prime Minister raised the carbon tax by 23% and refused to pass 234 in its original form to make food less expensive for Canadians. He's not worth the cost. Why is this Prime Minister punishing the poor and exterminating the middle class?
Good. Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Public Safety.
Wow, Mr. Speaker, that member who has advocated to roll back the rights of women just stood in this place and said that Conservatives can't wait to implement those measures. Wow. Mr. Speaker, women will remember what Conservatives are saying. They are saying they will take away women's rights just like in the U.S., and we will not stand for it.
Yeah. The Honourable Member for Lanark, Frontenac, Kingston.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, did you ever wonder why former inmates who have had vocational training while incarcerated are just as likely to reoffend as those who have not, despite the fact that Corrections Canada claims to have issued 112,000 vocational certificates in the past 3 years alone? Well, the answer is this. These vocational certificates are meaningless participation awards. In the same period, only 64 inmates in the entire country were able to complete a Red Seal apprenticeship program. Why has Corrections Canada failed to introduce real vocational certification programs?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Public Safety.
Mr. Speaker, the Harper Conservatives did everything in their power to restrict corrections from being able to offer offenders vocational opportunities to ensure that there isn't recidivism. Mr. Speaker, the Conservatives' own former criminal justice expert has come out condemning Conservative policy, saying it was not based in facts. Mr. Speaker, the Conservatives, when it comes to criminal justice, do nothing to keep our communities safe, but we have.
The Honourable Member for Yukon.
Mr. Speaker, the overdose crisis continues to devastate our country, and no region, including the North, has been spared. As a former Chief Medical Officer, I'm also deeply concerned by the level of disinformation currently being promulgated by the Conservatives. The study that I proposed is currently in Health Committee, allowing all parties to travel around the country, learn from experts, and make thoughtful recommendations to the government. Can the Minister of Mental Health and Addictions tell us if she agrees that to address this crisis we need to work together using the full spectrum of tools that we have?
The Honourable Minister of Mental Health and Addictions.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank the member. Just like the member from the Yukon said, we need to trust in science and in healthcare, not slogans written on the back of a napkin. Canada's model recognizes that prevention and treatment are two ends of the spectrum of care, but we also must care for people. People who are struggling in between the spaces while they struggle with substance use. People need to be alive to make it to recovery. Canada's model means supporting cities. It means supporting Indigenous peoples with the Emergency Treatment Fund. It means preventative measures like implementation of the Icelandic model. It means providing law enforcement with the tools they need. It means saving lives.
L'honorable député de Portneuf, Jacques Cartier.
Miss.
The Honourable Member for Portneuf, Jacques Cartier. Mr. Speaker, to listen to this government, you'd think that everything's going great. But actually, people are smothered by the cost of living. They can barely pay the bills after 9 years of this Liberal government. Currently, servicing the debt costs more than $54 billion. That's more than the health transfers to our provinces and territories. And the Bloc Québécois voted for this. The Bloc members say one thing and do the exact opposite. When will this Prime Minister stop wasting money so that Quebecers can regain their pride? The Honourable Government House Leader. I will tell my honourable colleague what Quebecers have regained: dental care, school lunch programs, nearly 35,000 new childcare spots funded by the Canadian government. They have regained a housing program and billions of dollars that have been agreed on with the Legault government in order to build new housing faster. So what Quebecers have regained here is progress, well-being, and real forward movement. The Honourable Member. As I was saying, this government thinks everything is doing great. I would like to invite them to visit some grocery stores. We see grocery stores putting anti-theft chips on T-bone steaks. That's how bad it is. After 9 years of this Liberal government, our debt has doubled, and yet our friends in the Bloc Québécois have voted for $500 billion in additional spending. Yesterday, Tiff Macklem, the Governor of the Bank of Canada, confirmed that this government's expenses is keeping interest rates high. When will this Prime Minister, supported by the Bloc Québécois, stop wasting money on the backs of Quebecers? The Honourable Government House Leader. Well, my colleague maybe didn't see the same thing as I did, but yesterday, the Governor of the Bank of Canada, the same person, by the way, that the Conservatives promised to fire, said that he is considering returning to a decrease in interest rates. And that is all confirmed by credit rating agencies like Moody's that are keeping Canada with its stable AAA credit rating. That's worth its weight in gold. We are responsible and are governing for Quebecers and Canadians. The Honourable Member for Beauce. Mr. Speaker, after 9 years of this Prime Minister, who's not worth the cost, his habits of wasting money have not changed. And so interest rates are extremely high, as we heard yesterday, confirmed by the Governor of the Bank of Canada. In my riding, Beauce, people are visiting food banks more, 20% more. It just shows that voting for the Bloc Québécois or the Liberals has a high cost. The Bloc Québécois keeps voting to support this inflationary government. When will this Prime Minister stop wasting money and help Quebecers feed and house themselves? The Honourable Government House Leader. Well, not only are there all the investments that I just enumerated, but also Canada has a AAA credit rating, the best in the G7, in fact, the best possible rating. And Moody's mentioned Canada's predictable, stable economic future, which was supported yesterday by the Governor of the Bank of Canada, who said that he is considering a decrease in interest rates in the near future, and we're very pleased about that.
L'honorable député de Châteauguay-Lacolle.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Democracies throughout the world are being increasingly threatened by state and non-state actors. For example, we've seen the direct aggression affecting Ukraine, as well as cybersecurity problems. And there's another threat that is ever-growing, right-wing and conspiracy theorist extremism. Can the Government House Leader tell us about the importance of standing firm against these threats? The Honourable Government House Leader. Mr. Speaker, what with the week we've just had, and dare I say even the last half hour, has been very sad for democracy in Canada. This conservative party, is clearly committed to destroying our fundamental rights. And we saw recently that the leader of the Conservative Party is encouraging white nationalists, anarchists, and misogynists. Things are going in a very dark direction, and I'm concerned.
Mr. Speaker, wildland firefighters have tirelessly kept our communities safe against devastating wildfires. But despite this dangerous and life-saving work, wildland firefighters aren't considered firefighters under the National Occupational Classification. And this impacts their retirement and pensions. It's absurd that the Liberal government and the Conservatives before them have done nothing to fix this. So will the Liberals immediately change this so that wildland firefighters can retire with financial security?
The Honourable Minister of Emergency Preparedness.
Mr. Speaker, I want to take this opportunity to thank all the wildland firefighters who have done amazing work. We have been working very closely with the provincial counterparts to address this issue, but one thing, make it clear, in fact, actually, we care very deeply for the work that they're doing. That's why we've actually increased the tax credit for the volunteer firefighters as well. So we'll do everything possible to make sure that we support them. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Kitchener Centre.
Mr. Speaker, the Ontario government is proceeding with construction on the destructive and unnecessary Highway 413, a $10 billion waste of public money to pave through the Greenbelt. This government could have put a stop to it by requiring a thorough environmental assessment in a Restored and Repaired Impact Assessment Act. Instead, they've proposed a change in an omnibus budget bill that could still let projects like Highway 413 off the hook. Will this government strengthen the proposed IAA and reject Highway 413 to prevent paving over 2,400 acres of farmland and green space?
The Honourable Minister of Environment and Climate Change.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank my honourable colleague for his question. I would remind him that the Supreme Court of Canada, in an opinion last year, told us that we had to revise the Impact Assessment Act. This is exactly what we do. But through an agreement with the Ontario government, we will make sure that federal laws like Species at Risks Act or the Migratory Birds will be able to apply to Project 413, and these elements will be assessed as part of this project. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
And that's all the time we have for question period today. I think we have a point of order from the honourable member for Durham.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, a point of order. Earlier this week, a lot of noise was made about the Leader of the Opposition saying the term wacko. And yet earlier, during question period, the government House Leader used decidedly unparliamentary language toward me in an attempt to defend his colleague from Whitby. I'd like to ask that, through you, that the government House Leader apologize and withdraw his comment.
Shameful language. I did not hear it because there was lots of noise happening around that time. Maybe what we can do is go back and listen to the honourable government House Leader.
I'm happy to withdraw whatever comment the member is referring to, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member. The honourable member for Leeds, Grenville, Thousand Islands, Rideau Lakes.
Speaker, so the government House Leader acknowledged that he did in fact use the term, which was captured by Hansard. It is customary that when this kind of language is used in the House, that an apology is offered by the offender. The offender in this case is the government House Leader and directed it at one of the newest members in the House, which is not only a terrible example, it's completely unacceptable. The honourable gentleman should apologize immediately.
The honourable government House Leader, like I said, I did not hear what the offending word was, but I would ask maybe just to retract it one more time and apologize, and then we'll.
Yeah, I've withdrawn whatever they're speaking about, Mr. Speaker.
And apologize.
I'm happy to apologize for whatever they're talking about too, Mr. Speaker.
But just for edification, we'll go back and have a look to see if there's anything on the tapes. Honourable member for Durham.
Yeah, I'd just like to confirm it was captured by Hansard, and it's very clear what the government House Leader said. Decidedly unparliamentary, especially for a government that made a lot of noise about the term wacko earlier this week.
We will have a look at that and come back to the House. Daily routine of business. Affaire courant ordinaire.
All right, everybody, that's it. As we can tell by this question period, there was a lot of BS being spewed by the Liberal side of the House. They were trying to inflate issues. Obviously, we know the Conservatives are not going to tear up the Charter of Rights, that the only thing they would do is use the notwithstanding clause when it came to the criminal justice system and the releasing of criminals. So we know they're just spewing bullcrap. So don't believe that. Make sure that when you're talking to people that you set the record straight, because the Conservatives are pretty heavy on this. They're gonna take away female rights and all this. That's a bunch of horse crap, and we all know it. And the Liberals are trying to use that to get an upper hand to just try to crush the Conservatives in some sort of way. They're getting desperate. They're going to start coming out with all kinds of phony rhetoric and BS. But anyway, anyone new to the channel, please like and subscribe. And we will see you on Monday at 11 a.m. Eastern Time. Have a good weekend, everybody.